All right, welcome back. My name is Mundo, and today I have a special guest with us, Dan from Call the Underwriter. Welcome to the show. First of all, I'm excited to learn about a little bit about yourself, your background, kind of what you're doing with Call the Underwriter, how that started, and hopefully you can educate our audience a little bit about the RMLO process and how that works and why it's important.
Yeah, sure. Well, first off, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. So some background on me. I'm basically on my third career at this point. So I started my career as a mechanical engineer in the aerospace industry,
Wow.
doing mechanism design and things like that. So I did that for about 10 years. And then I decided I didn't want to do government contracting for the rest of my life, although I love the big budgets. I got to work on some really cool projects, especially in the wake of September 11th and all that.
Well, you got
Um,
out at the right time because those budget cuts are coming.
Yeah, it's very cyclical. If you look at the history, the thing was when the money was flowing and we were doing cool stuff, I really enjoyed it. But then there were like dead spots where you're literally like sitting on your hands waiting for budgets to get approved. And it was cool, but I didn't want to do that for like another 30 years. So then I went and I did my MBA at the University of Colorado and then went into product management in the tech industry. So I worked for Oracle for 6 years, some startups, and then more recently AWS. And
Oh,
then
wow.
in the midst of that, I got into real estate because I had always done a lot of investing in stocks. Like since I was 19, I was always interested in investments, and I had invested through the .com boom and bust cycles. Like in the late 90s, I was convinced I was like a genius and had it all figured out until the crash came, and I realized I had no idea what I was doing. And then, in the financial crisis, right, you saw stocks take this, whatever it was, like a 30-40% drop. And so I wanted to diversify into real estate. And even back in 2016 ish, when I was looking at that, the market here in Denver was pretty challenging for rentals. Cap rates were pretty rough.
Mhm.
And so I was looking around for alternatives, and that's where I found mortgage notes. And that really appealed to me because one, my dad and my grandfather had worked in the loan business back in the day. Not that specific industry, but I kind of grew up around loans. And then when I was in business school, I had taken an elective course in fixed income, which is basically bond analysis. It's one of my favorite courses. And what I do in mortgage is a little bit different, but there's some similarities. So I was just kind of attracted to the subject. And what I always liked about mortgage notes is it's a really cool niche that's unexploited. So if you look at the size of the mortgage market and the seller finance mortgage market compared to the relatively small number of individuals who are running around taking advantage of it, it's really nice. So like unlike some other forms of real estate investment where everybody and their brother is chasing a relatively small number of deals, to me there was just always a lot more opportunity. So I've kind of settled in that space.
Nice. Very
Yeah.
cool. And so did you buy any real estate before jumping into that? Or that's where you
No, I
started?
went I went straight to notes. Yeah,
Okay.
so I
Didn't want to
skipped.
deal with landlord duties?
So I did that. That was my original plan. That's what I wanted to do. But as maybe at the time I didn't consider that you can invest at a state and there's other ways to do that. But when I was looking around the Denver area where I was, the math on the deals available didn't work out for me, and so that's why I ended up gravitating to notes. Now, if you do have a background in real estate, it certainly helps before you go into notes, but it's not necessarily required. There's pluses and minuses to it, right? Like having just the general real estate knowledge is definitely very helpful because then you can just add on the pieces of notes that you need to understand. On the other hand, it can be kind of helpful in some cases because some people, uh, it, there's some folks who kind of like they learn one model of investing or one system and then they struggle to branch outside of that, right? So in some cases people's minds get tracked on one way and then they have a hard time understanding notes. So there's pros and cons to both back coming at it from both backgrounds.
And so what led you to, because now you just recently purchased Call the Underwriter. So maybe tell me a little bit about like how that started. Did you know the owner? Was it a cold call? Like how did you come into that opportunity and what made you take that leap of faith?
Sure. So for people who aren't familiar, what Call the Underwriter does is we help people who are originating seller finance notes do that origination, understand the risk of the note, and then be compliant from a Dodd-Frank perspective and follow the consumer laws. So I actually became interested in this space a while ago, and prior to acquiring Call the Underwriter, I was working on spinning up a competitor. And so I had spent 4 or 5 months looking to enter the space anyways. The reason I was so interested in it is, for one, the seller finance market's a lot larger than people realize. There's 90,000 plus of these being originated a year. It's probably more than that because it's a little challenging to tease out of the county records. And if you look at the RMLOs that are out there, the way it's done, like the resource base to assist people with those is really poor. I mean, almost non-existent, right? So there's really a need in the market on the part of investors for that, because if you're doing a seller finance deal, you're doing a subject to deal, or creating a wrap, you're not necessarily going to be familiar with all of the consumer laws. And believe me, it's an alphabet soup, right? So like I spent months trying to understand the rules on originating these things, and it's not straightforward. Because one, there's not like one law you can just go read. There's a whole bunch of them that have actually been passed over decades, and the way they're written, they're kind of overlapping, and a lot of the language in them is very fuzzy. And as I was going through the 20-hour training you need to do to be an originator and talking to various attorneys, I mean, I've had cases where I've had two different attorneys give me different opinions on how to do something. So as an individual, like you're creating one loan or even a couple of them, you're going to have a hard time, figuring that out on your own. And so that's why there's a need for service providers who can help with, number one, doing the underwriting, vetting the borrower, making sure you have a solid loan. Like that's step one. Like one thing I'm working on is kind of dividing between the actual underwriting and the compliance piece. Like a lot of people are like, well, I know there's this compliance thing, I want to do that. But really what's almost as or more important is making sure that you're creating a solid loan, that you understand the borrower and the loan to value. So whether you plan on holding that loan or selling it off, like you got a pretty good vested interest in making sure you have a solid loan. And then on the compliance side, the big thing is, after the financial crisis, when they passed Dodd-Frank, so pre-financial crisis, right? You had all of these crazy loans where banks weren't verifying income, and you could just kind of say whatever and get a loan, and nobody cared. And what the law said, and it's funny deep diving this, I'm not a big fan of having multiple layers of confusing regulation to do something, but if you actually get all the way through it, it kind of I think the rules actually make a lot of sense. And they say that if you're making a loan for someone, mortgage loan, where it's going to be for their primary residence, meaning if they can't pay and they get foreclosed on, they're losing their home. You as the lender have to validate that they have the ability to make payments on that loan, which for one hand, you should kind of do that anyways, right? But you have to do that. And then there are some other rules around disclosures, right? So you have to provide the borrower a loan estimate 7 business days in advance, so they have the opportunity to review it. You have to provide closing disclosures 3 days before you close. And what they're really doing is cutting out a lot of predatory practices, right? So they don't want people making loans and saying, hey, as long as I get a big down payment, I don't care if they can pay or not, because I'll get this big down payment, I'll just foreclose and rinse and repeat. And, they have the disclosures. They don't want people just winging a stack of papers in front of somebody at the last minute with maybe some garbage terms buried in there and then just asking them to sign. And once you know the process and you're set up to do it, compliance doesn't really get in your way. You're going through this underwriting process you already want to do anyhow. It's just a matter of knowing the process and sending the right things out at the right times. So.
And are you guys involved? So you're obviously heavily involved on the front end of a transaction and
Mm-hmm.
providing a recommendation for the investor to whether approve or deny it. And from my understanding, they do have that option, right? You guys can make a recommendation and say, we don't think that this borrower is qualified based upon these regulations. But at the end of the day, they're still feel, they're able to make a decision themselves, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So in our transactions, the seller is actually the originator, so everything's kind of flip flopped from a traditional financing transaction. We're not like a bank. Call the Underwriter does not lend funds. We don't hold the loans. We act almost as a consultant in a way. You could think of it as to the people doing it. Right. And so ultimately it's their call. You can't stop them from doing things, but to your point, we make those recommendations, right? And sometimes the recommendation is, yeah, this was super solid, good to go. Sometimes the recommendation is, well, the loan's compliant, but it's kind of close to the edge. So you as the lender are gonna be taking on a little bit of risk. You're not gonna have a compliance issue, but it's a little bit of a marginal borrower. And then there's ones where I've told people straight up, like, even if the borrower can make this work, because what happens a lot of times is the borrower is not compliant because maybe there's things on their credit record, but they can clean that up, right, and make it compliant. And sometimes they have ones where they say, look, this person's got a lot of issues. They would have to clean up these 10 things. And even if they did that based on the record, like, I would not loan to this person. Now, one lesson learned I've had, and one like really key tip for people creating seller finance loans that I think is important, where I've seen people get painted into a corner a little bit, is they find a borrower, they get the sale under contract, they negotiate the terms and everything, they send it through the underwriting process. Maybe that takes a little bit of time because there's some back and forth with the borrower to get all the information, right? Sometimes the borrowers just give you all the information on day one. Other times, like, it's a little bit of a process to get everything. They get through all of this, they get to the end, and then they find out, there's problems. This loan isn't going to be compliant. It's not going to be great. And then the seller's kind of faced with this scenario where, do I start all over and list it and find a new borrower and go back to square one, or do I kind of grit my teeth and roll with it? And that's a really tough spot. And sometimes people just grit their teeth and roll with it, which is not great. The way that you keep yourself from getting painted into that corner is by pre-screening the borrowers. And so, like, on our website, we have a quick, like, 1-page pre-screening guide. But if you have an early conversation about the borrower, about what their income level is, what kind of debts they have, do they have bankruptcies and foreclosures recently? Have they been 60 days late on a mortgage payment in the last year? Most of the things that are going to disqualify the borrower, you can find out in a pretty quick conversation. So as long as they're being truthful, you're going to get a pretty good idea whether they're not going to clear. So one of my biggest pieces of advice is for people to have that conversation with the borrower early on. Don't get super excited and skip that because maybe they're willing to make a big down payment, because you might end up in one of those tough spots a couple weeks later.
Yeah, I remember not too long ago, I was consulting on a transaction, and the borrower, to your point, had some things on their credit report that were really kind of putting them on the borderline of being a good sellable note. And what was important to the seller was that they could create a note that was sellable and attractive. And so what they actually decided was to have the borrower pay off, instead of using the cash that was going to go to the seller, they were going to take $6,000 and pay off some of their debts to clean up, their personal situation. And I saw the seller willing to take a hit for that $6,000 just for the markability of the note to make it more attractive. So those are definitely trade-off decisions that you have to make. And if you're not familiar with the RMLO process on the front end and your exit strategy is to ultimately sell the note, I think it's really important to get educated on that. So that way you know what questions to ask on the front end to your borrower to, pre-vet and qualify before they even get to someone like you.
Yeah, and that's the other advantage of doing that underwriting process, right? So like aside from compliance and aside from knowing that you have a valuable note, if you're going to hold it, yeah, if you're going to wheel around and sell that note at some point, sometimes people create these with the intention of selling them right away. Other people hold on to them, but they may want to sell them at some point. If you've done that homework up front and you have that full underwriting package, your note's a lot more marketable because I'll tell you what, there are a lot of people out there looking to buy seller finance notes because you don't see as much bank originated paper these days. We had kind of this blip. It was more than a blip, after the financial crisis where banks had all this bad debt and they sold off and they kind of made their way through the system from big funds to smaller funds to individuals. And some of that stuff's still floating around, but like the people who are looking to buy notes for cash flow are generally looking at seller finance notes. And so if you look at the world, it's really interesting the last couple of months talking to so many people creating these because there is a wide range of standards that people follow. Like on one end of the barbell, there's a lot of people who just don't do anything. I mean, they act like it's like 1980 and there's no rules and they just let her rip. Right. And then there's people who are like the person you were talking about. They're like, okay, I'm going to cross every T and dot every I. Maybe I'm going to take a haircut to make sure this person is super clean. And then there's like people that do stuff in between. But if you want maximum value for your note, if you've done that homework, you have the underwriting package. People are, if I'm a buyer, number one, I'm going to want to buy that note a lot more and I'm going to pay more for that note versus the person who just stuck their finger in their ear and did something Wild West style. And who knows what you've got there.
Yeah. So how familiar are you with because you're on the front end, but how familiar are you with the secondary market as far as selling notes? Do you guys play in that space at all?
We do. Yeah. So I started buying notes on my own about 8 years ago. And so I own about 60 of them now, and I've used outside funding for a lot of that. So buying notes has been my main business. And so I'm pretty familiar with that ecosystem and haven't, the Call the Underwriter acquisition is fairly recent. So I've been kind of neck deep in the transition process, and we could talk about that more a little bit later. But one of the nice things about this is I have relationships with so many originators of seller finance notes, and I have a much better map of the seller finance ecosystem. A lot of those people who create notes do want to sell them. They're not necessarily familiar with the folks who want to buy. So one of the things I want to help the market with is, ultimately figuring out how to pair up those buyers and sellers so it becomes a more liquid market. So it's one of the challenges with notes. It's not a very liquid market, right? It's kind of a small world, very relationship focused for the most part.
Yeah, that would be an incredible amount of value to be able to provide that value to someone generating the notes on the front end and say, hey, I already have someone willing to buy it if it looks like this. Generally from what I see in the marketplace, it should have this interest rate, these terms, the borrower profile should look generally like this, and you can kind of help structure that in that way. That would be amazing.
Yeah, that's the other thing I recommend is people want to reach out to me ahead of time, because one of the other mistakes sometimes people make when they're originating their first note, and maybe they're not familiar with the seller finance world, they'll create a note with too small an interest rate. Like they'll say, oh, okay, like especially a couple of years ago when interest rates were like 3%, they were like, oh, well, I'll create my note at 5%. I'm getting way more. That's good. But the thing is, when you sell a note in the secondary market, at least to individuals, they're generally looking for a 10% plus return, right? So if you create a note with some 5% interest rate, then if you want to sell it, you might have to take a gigantic haircut, which nobody wants to do. So you need to consider the loan terms ahead of time. So sometimes people come to me with underwriting deals and the terms are not necessarily what I would recommend. But at that point, they've already negotiated with the buyer, they're under contract. It's kind of too late. So if people ever want to drop me an email or, give me a quick call to talk through it, I'm always happy to do that, with folks before they commit.
Yeah, no, appreciate that offer. So what do you see, like, let's say it's a 10% note, right? Are you still seeing the notes as far as, let's say it's a $30,000 principal note, 10% annual interest
Mm-hmm.
rate. Are you still seeing it being sold at a discount on the principal at that point? Because they want to get the value out of it on day one, right?
Yeah. So here's the thing. It's there are so many variables. It's hard to give a one size fits all answer. So I'll give a couple scenarios.
Yeah,
If
sure.
you're creating like super high quality, kind of like bank grade paper that you can sell to an institution, there are some smaller banks that will buy up that stuff. You could get someone to pay par for it. Par meaning like 100%
Yeah.
of the balance. There are a handful of investors who will provide table funding for deals, which means I set up this seller finance deal. I'm creating this loan at 10%, and somebody is going to step in just kind of like a bank would in a traditional transaction and finance that. Those folks are a little bit few and far between. The majority of the individual note buyers have been conditioned over many years, especially after the financial crisis when there's so much non-performing stuff on the market, to buy things at a discount. Um, and the thing is, depending on the kind of paper, right? The way I think of it is there's a million factors that determine the risk level of a loan, right? And
Mhm.
kind of my process for buying notes is I look at all these factors and I come up with what I think my required risk adjusted return is. So maybe it's 12%, right? And then I look at the loan terms and I back into a price. So whether I need a discount or not, or how much, to me is kind of like based on what return do I need based on that risk level. One of the problems, one of the things I think some note buyers do that holds them back a little bit is they anchor on getting some percentage discount. They're like, oh, well, I like to pay 80% of unpaid balance or 75%. But really, what makes sense is going to vary widely deal to deal. So, by and large, if you're selling a note, to get back to your original question, most buyers are going to want some kind of discount,
Mhm.
right? So you should kind of be prepared for that. And if it's a high
Probably like
quality,
that 20 to 30% range. Is that kind of where you're thinking?
no, so if you're creating like really high quality paper, 10% interest rate, you should be somewhere 10% discount or less, right? Because when you discount that, you're going to be north of a double digit return if it's really high quality stuff.
Mm.
If it's sketchy stuff, you didn't really vet the borrower, maybe the loan to value isn't right. You might need like a 20% return to buy that. So now based on the interest rate, yeah, you might be in that like 20-25% discount range, depending on the loan terms and how everything pans out. So the way that I like to think about it is like, what kind of paper do I have? What return do I need based on that risk level? And then I back into the price. And the discount just kind of is what it is. It kind of falls out from there. But there are a lot of people who are just allergic to not getting a discount. But there are lots of like good deals created with high rates of return that make sense, that are available. So, I think you just want to be flexible. Like the other thing I've been talking to people about lately is a lot of people, 5-10 years ago, they created kind of a recipe for how they buy notes. And the problem with that is the market evolves over time. So there's a lot of guys out there, very experienced folks, that know how to do due diligence and buy a note, work the borrowers and do all that stuff, that are kind of stuck on a recipe that doesn't work anymore. So you need to understand what you're doing, but then you also got to have flexibility that you can tune your recipe over time, right? Because the thing that works great in 2024, 2025 is probably not the exact strategy you're going to be using in 2030. So you need to understand like the fundamental concepts and then be able to adjust. That's what the best note investors do.
Awesome. So tell me about how you got into Call the Underwriter, like that whole opportunity to buy the company. I know you mentioned earlier that you were going to kind of fire up a competitor to that. So what made you decide to acquire instead?
Yeah, so I was actually I've been a client of Call the Underwriter for about 6 years.
Oh, okay.
So I've done a lot of non-performing notes, and so my non-performing model, I actually go out of my way not to foreclose. I try to rehab the borrower, but it doesn't always work, and so I end up with REOs. And when I have to sell that REO, when I can, I like to sell it on terms. And so, I've used Call the Underwriter, a number of times going back over 5 or 6 years or so. So I was very familiar with them and how they worked. And I knew the previous owner, Max, and had done some other business dealings with him. So I was very familiar and comfortable with them. I was interested in entering the space just because there's just such an unserved market. I mean, investors have a big need for these services, and there are just not a lot of folks out there to provide it, and they tend to be small. So I think there's a need for a larger, more scalable provider to help people originate these notes. And then the previous owners, when I found out that they were actually buying a completely different business in a different area, they were actually buying a much larger one. I was excited because I already knew him. They've been around since, I think, the original guy who started like in maybe 2017-ish. A lot of people are very familiar with it. There's this like existing client base. So that was great for me. So instead of like starting from zero, I was able to kind of take a big head start. Now, the challenge with that is having existing clients is great. It's a smoother process than starting from zero. But now as I make adjustments and set up the business and scale it the way I want, I've got to do that while you're serving customers. So there's pros and cons to those two ways of doing it.
Yeah. So what kind of like infrastructure do you guys have? Is there like, I imagine you probably work with some attorneys that are helping facilitate this process.
Yeah. So the way Call the Underwriter has worked previously, and most RMLOs work this way, they tend to be like one person shops.
Okay.
And if you've got a deal you need underwriting, how fast you get that depends on how busy they are at the time. And so what happens is, you might have slow periods, and if you submit something for underwriting when they're slow, you get it like that. If a bunch of people hit it once, then it slows down. And if your RMLO goes on vacation or gets sick, then everything might come to a halt for a little bit. And that's kind of the way everybody that I'm familiar with kind of does it right now. So what I'm doing is I've got 2 part-time people I hired so far to do loan processing. And then in January, hopefully I'll be bringing on another person who's bilingual, because that's another thing a lot of people have told me, like, hey, do you have someone who's bilingual who can get on with my borrowers? And what I've been doing over the last 2 months or so is just building a lot of the standard operating procedures and the systems so that we can have a team of people working multiple files. Because I'll tell you what, when we were doing the whole transition process after I acquired it, I sat down, did a lot of training with Max Bailey and his wife, and it was kind of making my head spin, especially as you're learning the whole process. Because the way a lot of people do this is just kind of, you have your loan software, but then a lot of it's just like out of their email box and, maybe a spreadsheet. There's not like CRMs and all the other systems. And so trying to keep 10 files straight at once was scrambling my brain
Yeah.
a little bit. And so I've had to put some other systems in place. So now I can go out and build a team so that now when someone submits a deal for underwriting, whoever's on call can pick that up and run with it. It's not a single point of failure, not depending on me or somebody else. And so it's going to take me a number of months to get all that built out where I want it. I'm also working on some workflow automation, to make that easier. I'm trying to get stuff out of email and spreadsheets. But it's a tough battle. It's harder than it sounds.
So you're pretty involved in pretty much every file that comes in at this point, right?
Yeah, I've
So
got my hands on all of them. And like I said, I'm not, maybe there's somebody I'm not aware of, but most most shops that I'm familiar with, that's how it is. It tends to be like a person,
Yeah.
that's what they do, which that's okay, but it's not really great, right? If you look at the 90,000 plus, probably this year over 100,000 deals being generated. Now, the reality, most of them are not going through any kind of underwriting, right? But once people start doing things the right way, there's going to be a big demand for these services, and it's not really going to be met by individuals in their email box, all day.
Yeah.
We need something else. So part of what I'm trying to do is just build out the vendor network to really enable seller finance and make it easy. Because the other thesis I have is, one, there's a lot of seller finance activity to begin with, but there would be more if there's a whole other segment of people that would do it if they even knew it existed. And then there's another segment of people who know it exists, but they don't know how to do it. And to be honest, it's not super easy, right? Like, even if hey, I have this property, I can't find a buyer to get bank financing. I know I can do seller finance, but how do I do that? It's not necessarily straightforward if you've never done it before and you're not already involved in a real estate investing ecosystem.
No,
So I think once that becomes easier, we'll see even more activity.
I find it super easy on my end. All I got to do is put in your ACH information, hit pay, and then hire you guys to take care of it for me. So it becomes pretty easy for me to do that.
Right. Yeah. And that's the thing, right? So, I mean, we do them all day, every day. So if somebody, it's just basic economics, right? Like, you have different people specializing in different pieces, and then they can do that really efficiently versus everybody trying to do everything all by themselves.
What are you seeing as like the most common mistakes that are happening when people are bringing files into, because by the time that they're bringing a file to you, I would guess that most of the people already have terms negotiated or signed promissory notes and all that stuff. And do you sometimes make recommendations and then they go back and renegotiate?
I haven't had anybody go back and renegotiate because once they're under a contract, they're kind of,
Yeah.
they're kind of locked in. I do talk to people all the time ahead of time, but I would say the biggest mistake people make, and a lot of times they make this just because they don't know, is not following any process at all, right? I mean, you don't have to go to Call the Underwriter. We're not the only game in town. Like, there's RMLOs that can do this, but a lot of people that aren't even aware that they have to do this stuff, right? And I would say there's a still to this day a very large number of loans being originated in or basically in a legal fashion. People are not following the consumer protection rules. A lot of times they have illegal terms. So there are, a lot of states will cap interest rates. And so like Pennsylvania is one that jumps out. I think they cap their interest rates on a owner occupied mortgage at like 6.5%, which is
Wow.
crazy.
Wow.
And there are people there who will, go, okay, seller finance loans are normally 9 or 10%. They roll with that. And then, you can find out later, oh, wait a second, like this isn't enforceable. And the other reason you go through this process, number one, you're doing it to make the loan valuable, but on the compliance side, what you're really guarding against, it's not that someone's going to see the loan recorded and come after you. I suppose that could happen, but that's probably a corner case. What you're really protecting against as the lender is the scenario where Your borrower stops paying, typically like right off the bat, without any significant life changes. They didn't have a job loss or divorce or medical thing. They default, you start foreclosing, borrower shows up in court and they say, oh, hey, I never had the ability to make these payments. I didn't understand what I was doing. This predatory lender took advantage of me. And if the judge says, oh, well, did you underwrite the loan? Did you validate their ability to repay? Did you send out the required disclosures? And if you're like, no, well, then you could get into dark territory, right then. Whereas if you've done the work and you have the underwriting packaging and say, no, we did all the things. Here's what we did. Boom. And then you're good. That's really the scenario that you're guarding against from a compliance perspective. And
I've seen that happen a
yeah.
lot.
So as far as other mistakes, like I would venture to guess that the vast majority of seller finance loans are not, just meeting those requirements. Like mistake one is not even doing anything. And I think a lot of people do that just because they don't even know necessarily. And then there's some people that don't know and don't care. I mean, there are people that are straight up predatory lenders and don't care. But then, assuming you're dialed in to that, one of the big things is, the interest rate, having too low of an interest rate, like looking at, the broader bank mortgage market and anchoring on those rates. Because if the borrower could get a bank loan, well, then they should just do that and get those rates, right? Like seller finance is always going to be more. That's one of the advantages to them, is they're getting access to financing that they wouldn't be able to get through a bank. And the other reason that's available, and the reason I think this is going to grow so much, not to tangent too much, but like if you look at what banks are doing, they're really retreating from a large part of the mortgage market that they used to serve, right? Because they're kind of capped on some of the fees that they can collect. And so under a certain dollar amount, because of banks' fixed costs, like they just don't bother. And I historically had thought that was kind of sub $100,000 houses. But now seeing a lot of these deals, a lot of them are $250,000, 300,000. So the chunk of the market that banks aren't servicing has been growing. So there's going to be ever more demand for this stuff.
So you mentioned seller financing quite a bit. So if you think about the transactions that are coming through you guys, are you seeing a lot of those being traditional straight up seller financing, or are you seeing like sub 2 hybrid transactions where there's an initial sub 2 with a seller finance note behind it?
Yeah, seeing a lot of sub 2 transactions and wraps. I would say I'm not sure what they are percentage wise. And a lot of times I don't necessarily know if it's a sub 2, right? Because you're vetting the loan. I don't necessarily see everything, but yeah, seeing that increasingly. And while I am not the expert on sub 2 at all, in fact, that's something I've really been digging into because some of my clients are doing that. And so I want to understand it in more depth just so that I can better advise them. But I would say in a lot of those, more complicated scenarios, it's probably all the more important to validate, that you've got a good borrower, especially if you're on the hook, to pay an underlying lien. So where if they stop paying, it could get troublesome.
Yeah, no, it's there's definitely a lot of sub 2 activity and it's continuing to increase. I mean, interest rates have not declined as much as would have thought. It's been hovering around this, north of 7 for a while.
Yeah.
And, why would someone go get a mortgage at 7% or even 8%? I had some loans that I bought, or properties that I bought last year, that originated like close to 8%. Why would you want to do that if you can acquire a property for 3.5%, right?
Yeah. And
And
part
make
of the
that cash flow a
reason
lot better.
I'm studying is that I might do that myself. So like when the last kid is out of the house here in a couple of years, like I've got a mortgage on this house at 2.75%. And when the
Wow.
day comes to sell that, right, like I'd rather not give up that loan if I don't
Yeah.
have to. And I think sub 2 is kind of similar to, some of these other, call them more niche areas. of real estate investment where if people understood how to do it, more people would do it, right? So some of the knowledge in some of these areas is a little bit opaque, and some people get hung up because they're more complicated maybe than just a traditional, I'm going to go buy a rental and get financing from a bank and that kind of thing, but they're not rocket science either. You know what I mean? So I think as more people learn about this stuff and know how to do it, more people are going to go out and get involved. So, but yeah, definitely seeing a lot of sub two deals, seeing a lot of mobile home deals as well. Like
Interesting.
that's another space, seeing a lot of activity. So it's kind of all over the map. What I'm not seeing so
And so
much.
mobile home deals, that would be more, you're not talking about mobile home parks, you're talking more like individual units.
Yeah, individual
Okay.
units. So there are a lot of people setting up financing companies to finance individual mobile homes. Now those are a little different because those are chattel loans. But what a lot of people are doing is, even though the rules on those are a little bit different, they like taking it through that full underwriting process, because what a lot of times they're doing is they're creating these loans and then selling them off. And so they want that tight package to make it more saleable. So the nice thing, and I have bought one of these, a lot of these mobile home loans are being written at like 15 to 18% because they're basically almost more similar to auto loans in a way. So if they're well underwritten, those can be pretty good value. Again, there's more risk in a mobile home than a single family residence, but then that's why you have this different interest rate to compensate for them. And so there are some good deals available in
What if,
those as well.
do you have times where the borrower that's being qualified as an investor, or is it always like a
Yeah,
homestead buyer?
yeah, no. A lot of mine are actually investor loans, which is interesting,
Okay.
right? Because if it's an investor loan, well, then Dodd-Frank and a lot of those consumer rules do not apply, right? So a lot of the compliance rules we talk about, those are for owner-occupied residences. But a lot
Mm.
of investors still use that process even when it's an investor loan, because it makes their loan more valuable. They know what they have, right? So if you're making an investor loan, traditionally, you might underwrite that based on, like let's say you're doing a seller finance loan to somebody, they're going to have the property as a rental. And so traditionally you would look at, okay, what's the rental income? Can they make this payment? Blah, blah, blah. And you still want to do that. But as kind of like a belt and suspenders approach, what a lot of people like to do is say, okay, if this person, for whatever reason, they don't have it rented, do they have enough income to cover this? And the credit report tells you a lot about the person as well, right? Because even if that rental property is producing plenty of income that they can pay your note, are they the kind of person who pays their bills, right? Like rent skimming is a tempting thing for a lot of folks. So it still has its place outside of where the compliance is actually required. That's why, to me, the compliance piece, I think people get overly concerned about it. It's kind of a thing that just comes along for the ride when you're doing stuff that you should be doing anyway when you originate a loan.
Yeah. So how do people feel on the secondary market about like junior loans? Like, let's say the borrower was an investor and what they did, they got qualified as them as an individual, as an investor, but then right at closing, a day later, they raised the funds from another investor, and then now there's a third position lien on the property or something like that.
Yeah, so people don't like those as much. So they're going to be less saleable. And when you do, people are going to want a higher return
Yeah.
for
But
those.
how
So
would
it's
that
all kind
work?
of a sliding
So
scale.
so you guys would like put together the package, and the understanding is that that note is going to be a second position, but there ends up being a third position. I assume whoever's buying it is not going and doing a title search
Oh,
before they buy it or anything like that, right?
yeah. So if I'm buying a note, I care about what position I'm in.
And not so much if there's a third or a fourth.
If there's liens behind me, I don't necessarily care, other than maybe from the standpoint of well, if this borrower's taken on all these liens, maybe they're going to go belly up, or maybe they're going to file bankruptcy. That it could increase my risk somewhat. But generally, like if I'm in first position, I don't care too much in general. I wouldn't say I don't care, but it's not necessarily going to directly impact me. Usually, when I'm buying a loan, I care about who's in front of me
Yeah.
overall. Now, when you do buy a note, you do want to do a title search. Usually, I do an O&E, an ownership and encumbrance report, which is not quite a full blown title search. But yeah, if you're buying a note, you definitely want to look at title, because you want to know what are all the liens on the property. Is there somebody in front of me that I don't know about? I want to know, are there delinquent taxes or their tax liens? Because I consider, tax liens are like position zero, right? Or are there other issues or other clouds on title? One of the other things I do in my process is I pull that report, and then I also have my attorney in that state review everything, because sometimes different states, like South Carolina has some where different states might have nuances where they require certain terms in the mortgage, or they might have certain like interest rate rules, like the Pennsylvania rule. And so I like having my attorney review that as well, to make sure that there's not something that I'm missing. These days, I've done enough. I can probably spot 90% plus percent of issues, but I'm not an attorney either. And I'm definitely not an attorney in 20 different states. So you definitely want to pull that title work and have an attorney review before you buy a note. Don't just do it. You're kind of sticking your neck out, if you just do it on your own. So I would always recommend doing your due diligence on that.
Have you had to well, I guess it would be more your personal experience. Have you had to foreclose on anybody?
Oh, a ton.
Really?
Yeah, a bunch. I've got a couple of them going on right now. Just earlier this week, I had a lady who I had a foreclosure auction scheduled for 3 days ago, and she filed bankruptcy the morning of the.
Oh,
Which that happens a lot. That's common. And if you're buying a non-performing note where you might have to foreclose, you need to factor that in,
yeah.
to your pricing equation. But yeah, I've done a lot. They're all over the map. When I buy non-performing, my model is I like to buy ones where the borrower is still in the property and they've made some payments in the last 12 months. I call that signs of life, right? So if the borrower's around, they've made some payments, then in my model, about 2/3 of the time, I can get it worked out where I get them paying again. The other third of the time, maybe we're doing cash for keys, although I haven't had anybody take me up on a cash for keys in a little while, or you end up in the foreclosure process. Although for me, I'm in Colorado. I've only ever bought one note in Colorado. All my stuff's in other places: Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, Mississippi, all over the map. So when I get an REO, it's a pain. And so I kind of go out of my way as the lender not to end up with those. But yeah, I end up doing them all the time. And it doesn't have to be that scary. I mean, basically, you're hiring an attorney. They're going to send a demand letter. If they don't do that, you're going to send the complaint. They will work through the process. The big thing, though, is it can be expensive and time consuming.
Mhm.
And, some people have it in their heads that, oh, the borrower's not paying, I can take the property back. Well, depending on the state you're in, if it's a judicial foreclosure, if the borrower fights you, if the borrower files bankruptcy to delay things like this lady just did this week, it can be a really long process, and you can easily stretch out over a year. I've had them go over 2 years, depending on
Wow.
how they
And
play out, right?
that would
And
be 2 years of
and
no income, right? On that note.
it's worse than that. There's no income on the note. There's the legal fees, but at the same time, if the borrower is not paying their mortgage, they're probably not paying taxes or insurance either. So you're paying
Um,
property taxes, and so you're incurring costs as that goes on. And like that's okay. It's just when you buy the note, you have to factor that in. And that's the other reason too why the predatory type lenders who go, hey, I'm creating this new note. Borrower's probably not great, but hey, they're giving me a good down payment, so I'll just foreclose and rinse and repeat. That foreclosure process may be quick and easy, and it may not. If they fight you. So, just while you legally have the right to take the property back, it can be painful. It's not always great. So you want to have that option available as a lender, but it's never been a go-to option for me, at least.
Yeah. Oof. That so it's just another day at the office for you on getting
Oh yeah, and it gets worse, and it can get worse, right? So it's funny, right? So it's kind of like when you do non-performing, there's a range of things that can happen based on how long the foreclosure goes and what's that cost. And then the other one is when you get the property back. Like, let's say if it's a land contract, there's no sheriff's auction, you just get the property, or depending where it is, if it goes to sheriff auction, it might not sell. There's like a lot of counties where there's just not a lot of activity at those. And then you don't know what you get, because when you're buying a note, and this is actually one advantage, if you're buying a newly originated seller finance note and they just sold it, well, you've got inside photos of the property. You kind of know what the property condition was recently, which is helpful. If you're buying a note that's been around for several years and maybe it's non-performing, as the note buyer, you don't have the right to go in the property. You can look at the outside, but you don't know what lurks behind the door. And so oftentimes borrowers who ride the ship down on a foreclosure, especially with a lender like me, who's like going to pains to work things out and not foreclose, those people aren't just neglecting their finances. They're not doing deferred, they're not doing maintenance. And, they tend to live a rough lifestyle. And so it's not that people are intentionally like damaging the property, but just they might be free ranging for a year, not fixing anything. So by the time you get it back, it gets rough. And I had one time that was a legit hoarder house, like literally three waist deep trash throughout the entire place. It was a 1,800 square foot house, and I had to get 4 40-yard dumpsters.
oh
So sometimes you go through all that stuff, and what you got back is rough. So I've gotten upside down on a couple of them for sure.
yeah.
I
So I
will.
mean, if you're a passive note investor, you're turning into an operator once you take.
Oh yeah. So here's the thing, right? So notes is a niche, but within there's like a ton of sub niches. If you're doing the non-performing stuff that I was talking about, that is not passive, right? And that is doing things on hard mode. It can be very lucrative. And like I said, it's a numbers game, right? So if you go out and you do 100 of these, most of them are going to work out pretty well. A couple of them are going to be home runs, just phenomenal. And then a couple you're going to get sideways on, right? If you want to be a passive investor and get cash flow, you can certainly do that in notes. You're just buying the higher quality performing notes. So, so you can pick and choose what you're going after when you're buying notes.
Yeah, at the end of the day, just like anything else, it's risk, reward, looking at that.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's risk versus reward. It's, how much work am I going to have to do? And it's funny, there's like this 80-20 rule that applies. Like some of my best non-performing deals didn't require much from me. We just kind of went through the process. The property sold. I made bank. It was great. But then you get a couple where, and it's funny because the ones that are the worst deals are the biggest time sinks. They're the ones where you end up with the REO. The REO is a mess. I've had vandalism a couple times, because I was saying like nothing good happens when a property's vacant, and so it's funny. My worst deals are the ones that I've sunk the most of my time in, and my best deals were the ones that I probably ended up spending the least time on. It's just the way it
Yeah.
works out.
Oh, yeah. Well, I appreciate you joining the show today. How can we find you online? I know you have a podcast as well. Tell me a
I
little bit about
do.
that.
Yeah. So you can find me at calltheunderwriter.com, or you can email me at dan@calltheunderwriter.com. But yeah, I have a podcast as well called the Note Investor Podcast. So if you just search for Note Investor or Dan Deppen, you'll find it there too. And then also have a YouTube channel called Fusion Notes. And you can find me on there as well.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thanks again, Dan, for joining, and learned a ton myself today. So thank you again for joining the show.
No, anytime. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
All right. See ya.